I am joined today by Mr. Scott Young. I asked ChatGPT to describe Scott in 280 characters. Here's what it said. Scott Young is the mind behind Ultralearning, the playbook for mastering any skill at lightning speed. He famously finished MIT's 4-year computer science degree in just 12 months and now teaches how anyone can learn faster, deeper, and better. Scott, what do you think the one thing you know about learning that most people don't realize?
Ooh, one thing that I know about learning. Well, oh man, now you got me on the flat foot. I feel like there's so many things I have to pick from one. I would say that in general, people don't have a good understanding of what's involved when they're learning things. So I think the perspective that I take that I think is maybe most difficult are sort of not what people typically think, is that learning anything that's big and complicated is actually learning a lot of little small pieces. And I think people tend to view learning as this all or nothing event. Like you either get it or you don't, or you know it or you don't, but it's really figuring out what those bits and pieces are and then figuring out how to acquire them that I think makes the difference between people who can learn effectively and people who struggle. And it also makes it, I think, a more hopeful message too, because if it is really just a bunch of small pieces that anyone individually can do, then that means that you can also learn something. There's no some mystical leap that you have to take in order to get to some new level.
And I think that mysticism is an important point because people tend to, you've done some incredible feats when it comes to an ability to learn things, whether it's like language learning or what you did with MIT, like I just explained. And people tend to like pedestalize or think that fundamentally you are different than them in some way because you're able to do these things. But, for the course of the podcast and from having so many of these conversations, you realize that, it's just not the case. And it's just, a matter, like you just said, of like understanding those small things and doing them on a consistent basis.
Well, yeah, I feel like, I don't know, I'm definitely guilty of, like, these were projects that I undertook when I was very much not known by anyone. And so they definitely have a bit of a hook quality to them that now, as 15 plus years later, it's sort of like, okay, this maybe sounds a little bit more grandiose than it actually is. I feel like the truth of it is, I'm not going to make some strong claim that like everyone can learn everything at exactly the same rate and speed. There's so many factors that influence how you go to learn things. But the basic mechanisms, I think, are pretty universal. And so if you want to speak a language, you have to learn a lot of words. And so it's really just a process of figuring out, okay, what's the right way to learn the words. And I don't want to say that there's obviously more to it than that too. You got to be able to pronounce things and string together sentences and stuff. But this idea of like, what is the vocabulary of the skill or subject you're learning? How do you efficiently acquire it? There's no magic to it. It's just a process of figuring out how do you learn the words? What's a good way of doing that? And then putting in the time and having the actual motivation to stick through it and see it to the end.
Let's break that down. I think an interesting way to approach that question would be like if you had a school and you had a semester curriculum where you were teaching how to learn, what would that curriculum look like? Like, what are those principles there or those things that you think, we need to know in order to be able to, just learn effectively?
Yeah. So, I'd probably start with the kinds of subjects and chapters that I wrote in my books because I feel like those were important topics. I think the first thing to start when you're dealing with any discussion of learning is to focus on how memory works, because memory is that's the substrate of all learning. You only learn things because you've made a change to your memory. And I think sort of colloquially when we talk about memory, it brings up these ideas of rote memorization and like drills and this kind of stuff. And we think about all the skills that maybe we learned where we didn't do that, we just picked out outside of school. And so there seems to be something kind of artificial about it. But if you think about it, the fact that you're able to remember what you ate for breakfast today, this is like a feat of memory. Everything in our life is just this constant changing of the brain. So there's a lot of things that we've learned scientifically about, like principles about how memory works. So I would say one of the big principles that I talk about in my books is this idea of spacing. So if you, one of the most robust effects in psychology is that if you have, let's say, 10 opportunities to learn something simple, like it could be a skill that you're learning, it could be like a fact, it could be a concept. If you put those 10 opportunities stacked back, so you study for them over an hour, let's say, in one go, versus you study them over, let's say, 10 sessions spread out over 10 weeks, you'll feel like you learned less in the latter category. So if you ask people right after they've done this, which ones, feel more confident about learning, it's going to be the people who crammed it together. But actually, if you do the memory test long term, it's going to be the people who spread it out. So this is an example of like a very generic principle of how memory works that affects how you learn things, because a lot of what I'm trying to do when I'm working on a memory intensive studying project, like learning language or this kind of thing, is figuring out how you can space out all these exposures so that you don't learn the same word just once. You learn it like 15 times and it's spread out, so that by the time you hear it the 15th time, it's automatic, as opposed to oh, what was that again, and you're forgetting it. So that's just an example of like a little thing that I would point out, is just focusing on memory, focusing on these basic principles. There's a few others that we can get into, and then from there, just focusing on sort of like, what are the mechanics? How do people learn skills? How do people learn to solve hard problems? How do people build expertise? These sort of basic mental models, I think, that you go into the learning project really shape the directions you pursue. Again, there's no magic to it, but if you know that, okay, well, the way that people become really good at chess, for instance, is they build these huge libraries of patterns in their head that allow them to perceptually look at the chessboard, see what kind of chessboard it is, and that immediately suggests a good move most of the time. That this is how good chess players actually do it, is a very informative little piece of information, because you might have the impression that they just have this like superior brain power and they're just processing like 15 moves deep in like all sorts of directions, that there's some kind of supercomputer, in which case you say, well, there's no way I could ever do that, so there's no way I could be a good chess player. When you realize that, no, it's actually more like they know this language that you don't know, which has tens of thousands of words, except the words are different positions on the chessboard.
I think about for myself, coming from a background of playing baseball my whole life. And like, you mentioned, when we think about learning and studying, we think in that traditional fashion that we did in school, where it was cramming and sitting down with flashcards and doing this thing deliberately. And it seems like that key word is deliberately. And I think about baseball, and like, you really get better not when you're mindlessly swinging a bat, but when you're deliberately practicing. And there's this difference between doing something with this deliberate intention and just going through the motions, if you will.
Yeah. Well, I mean, especially when we're dealing with skills, so something where you're trying to refine your performance, a long-standing finding of psychology is that people don't get automatically better at skills. So what happens is you practice something more and more. The kind of mindless practice you're doing is that you get increasingly fluent at it, which means it requires less and less effort. Fluency is important for skills. I don't want to like be deriding it. You wouldn't be able to read a book if learning the sound letter combinations wasn't 100% fluent. It would just be agonizing to read even a paragraph. This is something that most, reasonable elementary students become fluent in by, third, fourth grade, right? And, as adults after, we're far beyond the 10,000 hours for learning to read in this kind of sense. However, when you're learning a skill like baseball or playing the violin or any kind of complicated task, the fluency can be a double-edged sword. So you need it to become proficient at the skill. But if you become really, really proficient, kind of locking in, let's say, a somewhat inferior way of doing it, or not necessarily the best solution for that particular pattern, then you become really, really good at doing something that's a little bit suboptimal. So the example I like to give for this, because the one that I think hits home for most people, is that depending on who you are, you learn one of two different ways to type on a computer. There are the people who didn't take a formal typing course, and they do a kind of hunting and pecking. So maybe they're using one finger, two fingers, maybe they got two fingers on each side, and they got some kind of method. Maybe they don't need to look at the computer keyboard all the time. If you're still using a computer keyboard, I'm a bit of an old fogey now with this example. Everyone's using their phones and the touch screens. But if you are using a keyboard and you're using that method, you may be, have done this for decades and you can reach some level of speed with this hunting and pecking. But if you learn to touch type, which is where you have your, all four fingers from, your minus your thumb on the home row, and then you have your thumbs, you can type much faster. So, probably, I don't know if there's any been formal study of the hunters and peckers versus the touch typers, but, good touch typists can type 100 words per minute. If you're just a hunting and pecking on the keyboard, maybe you're going to like cap out at like 40 or 50 just because of the physics of being able to, only move a couple fingers. And so the idea being that lots and lots of practice will make you more fluent at both of these skills, but it will not on its own shift the person who's hunting and pecking to touch typing. That bridge won't be crossed. It's not like you're eventually going to evolve into touch typing if you just practice enough. And so this is the idea behind deliberate practice, the sense that when we are trying to not just become fluent at a skill because we're doing it a lot, but because we want to become truly excellent at it, we're trying to nudge ourselves in kind of what is sometimes the more effortful path, the thing that's not as fluent, that you're trying to pronounce the word correctly and not just the way that it sounds in your native accent. And so you're straining a little bit to like make your tongue make the position that feels a little unnatural to it. Or you are trying this really difficult piano solo and it takes you a bunch of repetitions to like work out the difficult finger movements. So these are, I think, a hallmark of this kind of elite level skill production. Now, it's certainly not the whole story for learning. So I think there are cases where simply doing something a lot is probably the right way to go about learning something. But definitely how we adjust the difficulty and this paradox in some sense that, you can spend a lot of time doing something and achieve suboptimal performance is an important thing to keep in mind, especially with the things that we do truly want to spend, let's say, the next 10 years getting really good at.
I have to ask you about this year without English because I'm somebody who, my family's Cuban, and I'm the only one in my family who is not fluent in Spanish. And funny enough, I was fluent when I was like 3-4 years old. I was just as good at Spanish as I was at English. And then, you don't speak it and you lose it. So you went a whole year without English. I'm very curious from a perspective of somebody on the outside looking in, trying to learn a language, feeling like you're kind of starting from zero. And then two, just like that experience in general and what you did and how that was.
Yeah, sure. So this is a project that I did with a friend about, it would have been, 12 years ago now. Now when I say this, it just like yawns back in time. But this was about 12 years ago, so 2013. My friend and I, we decided we were going to go on a world trip, and we were going to go to 4 different countries, and we wanted to learn some of the language in each country that we went to. And we were going to spend 3 months in each stop. And the idea of the sort of method, which was something that I had kind of trialed out a little bit before with learning French, was that when we landed in the country, we were only going to speak in the language we were trying to learn. And I mean, there's obviously, exceptions and mistakes and this kind of thing in that adherence to the rule. But the basic idea was that, contrary to what most people would do, we were going to speak when we were in Spain in Spanish to each other, which is unusual because neither of us speak Spanish particularly well. And then also when we met people, we would only speak in Spanish, which has this is I would say a very effective way of getting immersion, because if you can do it when you land in a country or soon after you arrive somewhere, you have the opportunity to create kind of a linguistic bubble around yourself. And most people, when they go to another country, if they don't feel really proficient in the language, do the opposite. They lean on their native language, but then you make mostly associations, friendships, sort of the bubble around yourself becomes English. And then it becomes sort of surprisingly hard to use Spanish even though you're living in Madrid, or it's hard to use French even though you're living in Paris. It's like, well, everyone around you is speaking French, but like the people talking to you are speaking in English, and so it's hard to get enough practice time. So this kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier of like a skill that benefits from simply doing it a lot. And I would say that at least I would say 80% of language learning is simply that we don't have enough fluency. You don't have enough, like it's not effortless enough that you can just automatically do it. And so, deliberate practice is obviously important, but I would say that, if you are a monolingual speaker and you live in North America, and you are wanting to, learn Mandarin Chinese or Korean or some other language, the difficulty is going to be that you use English like 16 hours a day, but then maybe like once a week you do like one painful 30-minute session of which you're mostly listening and doing notes and stuff. Like just at that pace, it's going to take you a long time to get hundreds of hours of practice in. Whereas if you were to, be in this immersive context for a period of time, you could accelerate that timetable significantly. And I think that the experiment showed that it worked. I mean, I would not say that we were perfectly fluent in either of those languages. And certainly after 13 years of not living in those countries, they've atrophied to some extent. But I would say that definitely after like 3 months of Spanish, I did much better in Spanish than I had in like my year of living in France where I wasn't following this rule, and definitely from like years of French that I took in high school and stuff like that, which I didn't make much progress in either. So I think it's, if you're an adventurous type, it's definitely a project worth considering.
And so essentially it's just like because I'm trying to piece that out into an actionable way to do it for an individual who, let's say,
Sure.
isn't living in one of those countries or a country
Okay.
that the native language.
So you want to do it at
how
home?
would
You want to do it in like North America?
Yeah. How would you
Okay.
break that down?
So I think a more representative project is actually something I did a couple years after that. I did a project with my wife. Now, my wife grew up in, she was born in Yugoslavia. It's now North Macedonia, and she speaks Macedonian. And when this was 2020, this was right after my son was born, we decided we were going to do some version of this project, but we were at home. This was like quarantine era, if you can remember those fun times. We decided, okay, well, we're only going to speak in Macedonian to each other. And we did it for a month. And my Macedonian, just like we did in the Spanish project, went up considerably over this time period. But it was a more limited immersion. So it was just between us, and it wasn't like, I was still using English when I was talking to anybody else, right? And it was the pandemic, so it was a little bit more, in quarantine, a little bit more concentrated than it would otherwise be. But I think you could definitely have a more limited scope version of what we're talking about. So if you want to learn a language and you live in a decent sized city, there's probably some meetup that does that language, and you could just attend it weekly. Now, obviously, attending for an hour a week is much slower than doing it, 8 hours a day, but you can still make progress in this direction. And so I think it's really just a question of how much commitment and time you can invest in doing that. But I found that I don't think it's the living in the country that really makes the difference, although it can create opportunities for using the language. But in some ways, doing it at home, if you have people around you, like you mentioned, like your family members speak in Spanish, so like family trip, like that's an obvious opportunity for doing something like this. That can often be easier because you don't have to deal with necessarily some of the other stuff we were dealing with. Like I remember when we went to Brazil, for instance, we were like, okay, we're going to start learning Portuguese. We didn't practice at all before, which I don't recommend. Like if you're going to go all in 100% that language, you should try to do a little bit of practice before, because it could be a little bumpy in the beginning if you don't. But we land in Brazil, and the sort of Airbnb we rented was like not suitable for living in, and we just suddenly found ourselves kind of semi-homeless for the first 2 weeks. So on top of like learning Portuguese and trying to deal with all of that, we were kind of like bumming around in like whatever hotels we could stay at, and like going door to door in this like little town and asking if they had an apartment for rent in our like very broken Portuguese. And so like this was a kind of like, yes, it was a good experience in terms of practicing, but we were adding a bunch of other complications that didn't necessarily help us learn better. And so I think if you were going to approach the project from home, it might, even if it's a more limited context, it might be more manageable for you. So I wouldn't discourage you. It doesn't have to be 100% of your life, but I think if you can make it in terms of a relationship, like, okay, I'm going to speak with my friend, my roommate, my spouse for some period of time, that can make a big difference, because it's mostly habit. Once you start speaking to someone in one language, you kind of get used to it over a period of time.
No doubt. And like, even as you're speaking, even as you're saying that, I'm thinking about, watching some TV in Spanish and listening to a podcast in Spanish on a walk, like just trying to, immerse yourself as much as possible in that language, getting creative with it, because there's so many different ways. Like, in the age of the internet, there's infinite ways to learn different things. And I've even been thinking recently about like how to leverage like AI tools to learn things. And kind of having ChatGPT as your study buddy and stuff like that. Have you looked into anything in that world?
I mean, yeah, I've played around with it a little bit. I definitely think the project would have looked different if I did it today, because we were very reliant on Google Translate, and that was sort of a new technology. Just the fact that you could translate not just like dictionary words, but like whole sentences was a big deal. Like, it meant that you could just bridge a lot of conversation gaps because you just type it in English and then you like read out what it says. And so that was like a little bit of a, escape clause. It's not like people be like, oh, that's cheating. But like, if you've ever done it in real life, it's like so annoying to do that like you quickly try to not do it. So it is a good learning tool. But now we've reached a point where, I mean, now you can see people having these conversations where like one person speaks in English and then the AI says what they said in Korean, and then the person says in Korean, like this automatic translator. I don't know whether that would be very helpful, because to me that kind of would like obviate the need for you to actually think and speak in that language. But you can think about all these different ways that it could help you, from helping you make flashcards to, like I'll give an example. So I had to give, this was pretty recent. I had to give and what was it for? I don't remember what it was for, but I had to give a little speech in Mandarin for something, and I had to write it myself. And I wrote it, and then I was thinking, well, like I'll give it to ChatGPT to like kind of basically critique it, because I wrote it in Mandarin, but like I'm not a native speaker. So if you've ever like, if you I don't know if you've ever seen, but like someone, even if they're fairly conversationally competent, if they try to like write a speech in English, it's gonna have like some little like, well, that's not quite how we'd say that. That's a little bit of a weird way to say that. This kind of thing. So it was really good for doing that. I think we were doing promo for. I did the same thing for Spanish too. We were doing promo for my last book, Get Better at Anything, which is Mejora en Todo, if you would like to read it in Espanol. And they wanted me to do a little bit of promo. And I did the same kind of thing. I was just sort of like, does this sound weird what I'm saying here? And like they gave me some critique. So I feel like as a tutor, I mean, that would have been the kind of thing you'd have to hire someone to help you with when we were doing it on the trip. I don't really like it so much for conversation partner, not because I'm like humans only and I'm like anti-AI in any like really deep sense, but just because I feel like AI has this tendency to speak in paragraphs and you have to respond in paragraphs. So it's actually like really difficult to have a conversation with it, because the beauty of like early language conversations is it's all this like kind of stuttering over like a few words and like, oh yeah, this, and then you're like back and forth. Like that's almost impossible to have with an AI, where like it either doesn't understand you or it gives you like a wall of text as a response. But I think it could be a useful tool for tutoring, helping you with, what's the right way to say this, what's an idiomatic way to say this, helping you make flashcards, helping you be kind of a study guide, and even just for motivation. I mean, I know a lot of people even just like it as a kind of, a little bit of like, keep going, you're doing good, kind of like you need a little bit of that sometimes when you're struggling with a new language.
How do you think your two books are? So two things here that have been popping in my head. The first one is like I've been really curious lately with how AI has or is going to affect like learning in general. Like I think about school and all the things I did growing up, and like a lot of it's kind of seeming like it's becoming irrelevant. And the question that prompted in my head is like, one, like, what does that mean for learning? And two, I was curious about the difference between getting better at anything and ultra learning. Like, what is the key distinction between those two things?
Okay. So, well, with the first one, we're talking about how is AI going to influence learning. Do we mean kind of process or outcomes? Like, do we mean like how AI is going to change the way that people learn, or how is AI going to change what we're learning or what we ought to learn? Because I feel like I could have an hour conversation on either of those topics. Which one do you want me to pick?
I know, right? It's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Go in either direction. I think they're both pretty
Okay.
interesting to me.
All
I
right.
don't know if either one of those is
Well,
more
so
applicable for you.
because you mentioned it, kind of like a lot of this feels irrelevant in schoolwork and this kind of stuff. I'm going to take it's weird to say contrarian, but I go on a lot of podcasts where this is the contrarian take, that like education is worthwhile and learning things is worthwhile, and that it's kind of independent of technology. So my best example of that is learning arithmetic. We have not needed to do arithmetic like since the calculator was invented. Like really, like if I need to like add 3-digit numbers together, I can easily just do it on my phone. And I often do. Like it's just you have not needed to do arithmetic. So why do we teach kids math? Right? Like why do we bother teaching them arithmetic? Well, the reason you teach them arithmetic is because these are the building blocks for more complicated math, for more complicated skills. And so I would argue, and I mean, if someone wishes to disagree, I'd happy to have a disagreement with them, but I would argue that it is not possible to understand like physics, engineering, the stuff that at least, for the time being, I know we're like, speaking of this, maybe that it's going to change in a couple of years, but for the time being, skills that only human beings can do, like the advanced conceptual stuff of like, engineering, thinking about like how to design things, solving quantitative problems. It's not possible to do those. It's not possible to acquire those skills if you haven't learned arithmetic. This is my contention, and I think there's some good cognitive science to support it. And you can take this analogy to many other places. So for reading, for instance, it seems kind of silly. Why do we teach kids like, sounding out every word? Because like that's not what adult readers do. They just like flip through and they just read all the words. But actually, we know because of neuroscience that this is an illusion. That what we're actually doing when we read text is we look at pretty much every single word and we read pretty much every single letter and we stitch it together. The issue is that it's so overlearned that it takes part in a place of our brain that is kind of outside of conscious awareness. So we have these sort of like complicated neural nets in our visual cortex, which are like quickly deciphering what the word is. These are linking up with auditory cortex parts that are matching them to sounds. And this is happening in like milliseconds so that we just read the word. We don't have to do any of this mental processing. As far as I know, there's no way to acquire that skill without going through the previous step of like laboriously doing it, of like actually doing like b, a, t, bat, and like, there's no other good way of doing it. And so, okay, this point being that, yeah, what education is doing is teaching you a lot of stuff. Like, well, why do I need to know that? I can just look that up. No, it's because you need it in the substrate of your brain in order to be able to do the stuff that you actually care about later. And so I think we could get in a conversation about like, is all of the stuff in schooling necessary? Is like everything? And probably not. But the thing that's hard to say is that, people have wildly divergent opinions about like which stuff is necessary, which stuff should be included. But I would my opinion is to take more like some people use that sort of uncertainty as the kind of like, well, we should try to learn less. Whereas I take the more opposite position that given that we don't know exactly what knowledge you need to succeed in various tasks, and we want to have flexibility and understanding this kind of stuff, you actually need to learn a lot. You need to know a lot of things to be smart in today's world. And in some ways, AI has accelerated the need for that rather than replaced it. Because as AI continues to like chip away at some of the simpler tasks, the shorter time horizon, the stuff that would have been faster to learn, human beings are going to increasingly have to rely on more creative, synthetic, analytical skills that are, currently maybe it's the case that, ChatGPT can write a really good limerick, but I can say right now, I've read it, it doesn't make really good essays. It does okay essays, but like they're not great. They're just kind of like, this is all right, but it's not going to be like award winning, and certainly not writing great books. I've not read a single like book length thing by ChatGPT that's very good. So what does this say? This says that the human input to that process is coming at a higher and higher level. It's happening at like the human who can write a great book is going to be the one who is going forward as opposed to the one who can write a great limerick. And I think that, assuming that the AI just doesn't completely overtake us and does everything, and then I don't know, all bets are off once it does everything human beings can do better than we can. But while we're still in this sort of middle zone where there's things that it can do, things that it can't do, everything is pushing us to be smarter versions of ourselves, I think, rather than less intelligent versions of ourselves. And that's my strong belief on the kind of the what. So when people, students in particular, are kind of like using AI tools to essentially not learn any of their classwork, I do worry because I think in some cases they're
Yeah,
shooting
me
themselves
too.
in the foot. Now maybe you think that they like the stuff that you're learning in school is useless, and we can have an argument about that. I don't want to say everything you learn is useful, but I do think when you have this kind of lazy approach to it, yeah, you don't need to do an essay assignment very often in real life if you're not actually a writer, but you do need to understand the things that the essay assignment was trying to get you to understand. That was why you were doing it. And so if you just get ChatGPT to do it, you're not necessarily going to understand anything, and then you're going to kind of rob yourself of that experience. So I'm becoming a bit of an old fogey
Totally.
talking about the kids these days, but that's
Me too.
that's where
I
I am,
was
right?
even thinking about it as myself, like even just a few years ago when I was in college and I was thinking, you fall into that same mindset of like, dude, this stuff that I'm learning is nonsense. But at the end of the day, like I worry about myself now in terms of like parts of my brain atrophying from an over reliance on AI tools. Like, I have a pretty good knowledge base now on how to leverage artificial intelligence, and I take advantage of that. But I think about a lot of the things that now are feeling like heavier and heavier burdens just because I've gotten so used to relying on ChatGPT to do those
Yeah.
things for me. So yeah, it's a concern. We'll see where everything takes us.
Well, I'll give you my take. The right way to use ChatGPT is to ask it to tell you which papers to read, not to tell you to read the papers for you. So like if you're getting it to be like, tell me what to learn, tell me what I should be like, what am I missing, what don't I understand, and then you're going deeper, then it's like fantastic. Like this is such an amazing tool, and I think I'm very pro AI in the sense that I am not one of these dismissive curmudgeons that like I think that it's revolutionary. Like the stuff that I struggle with learning, where there was like no good solution and you just kind of have to brute force it. Like it's solved now. Like there's so many issues where I was doing MIT coursework and you're like, I don't understand the answer to this, and you just have to kind of like figure it out, and it's grinding because you don't have a good tutor.
Yeah.
Now I could just be like upload it and be like, what did I get wrong? Why did I get this wrong? Explain it to me. You just save yourself so much work. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like as soon as the calculator was invented, we could suddenly, do much more complicated math, but we could also forget a lot of the math that we were previously sustaining with our skills. And so this is a big complicated discussion about what's going to win on the end, but I have this general belief about technology that it exacerbates both our virtues, our opportunities, and our vices. And so it's very easy to look at through either lens. And I think that certainly for a lot of people, given that learning is effortful and often avoided by people in society, the exacerbation of vice, I would definitely say, is going to predominate going forward. But that doesn't mean that it's a bad tool for those who can make use of it.
No doubt. And I think about, for the individuals that do want to gain mastery over certain domains, it's quite the advantage. No doubt about that. So when it comes to that conversation of like gaining mastery over a domain, I know you have like 12 maxims for achieving mastery. Like what would you say, what are those 12 maxims or 12 things that we need to know if we're individuals who want to gain mastery in our life?
Right. So just bringing back to the previous question you asked me, what's the difference in get better at anything and Ultralearning? So Ultralearning was a little bit more personal. It was about a specific approach to learning, like aggressive, self-directed learning, of which these kind of projects were a part. And so that was the sort of thrust of the book, was kind of looking at these stories of these people who were learning things on their own and kind of like, how do they do it? And then Get Better at Anything was much more driven by a desire on my own part to like understand the science of learning, what we know about how it works, what are the basic ingredients. So it's a bit more general in that sense, that it's not specific to this ultra learning context, but it's also a little bit more in the, I would say, understanding first principles rather than like the concrete examples. So Get Better at Anything, I divide these 12 maxims into 3 different basic ingredients that go into learning. So there's see, do, and feedback. So to get good at anything, first you have to see. You have to see how other people do it. And this was a major revelation in doing research for the book, that it's abundantly clear that most of what we know how to do comes from observing other people, and that very, very little of our knowledge is self-generated. And even people who are like laud themselves for their great creative discoveries, usually they're putting this like tiny molehill on this mountain of knowledge that they absorbed through culture, through observation, through reading, through this kind of thing. So that idea that, you know, actually if you just set people down and you don't give them any prior knowledge and ask them to solve problems, they're quite bad at it. Like, we're not actually that smart in that sense as a species. I think goes against people's self-image in some sense. But I think it also shows that one of our great strengths is that if someone else can learn something, you can quickly kind of absorb from their trial and error, oh, this is the right way to do it, and you can emulate them. So that's the first part. So the first 4 maxims are sort of related to that process. So I talk about problem solving and search, which is this like very important theory of like how people even solve problems and what are some of the like strengths and limitations of that. I talk about the idea of cognitive load theory in the next chapter, which is a sense in which for some situations, very counterintuitively, you actually learn to solve problems better by observing an example than actually solving it yourself, which runs contrary to how a lot of people, I think about learning. And then I talk about the idea of mastery. So it's building up small experiences of success, builds motivation, and a lot of that is not only experiencing mastery yourself, but seeing other people succeed in a skill. And then finally, this idea that as you continue to practice a skill, it becomes invisible with experience. So this becomes sort of an asset. It goes back to what we were talking about, where you get more and more fluent at a skill, but it also makes it harder to teach. So it makes it so that often the expert has a really difficult time explaining how they're able to do a skill. And this can lead to, you know, some obstacles in this sort of seeing process, because if you're dealing with someone who is a great expert, they may be a lousy teacher because they sort of just take for granted a lot of the knowledge and unconscious competency that they've developed. So the reading is the case in point where, you know, a lot of people who are excellent readers are quite impatient at teaching kids to read because, you know, they just take for granted that that's how you say this word and this kind of thing. And they're not actually thinking through what is like the novel problem for the child, which is like, you know, the word is actually ends with a Z sound. Like, you don't even think about that, but it does, right? So they say is, and then you're like, no, it's is, right? Like, but these are like little bits and pieces that you struggle with because you've just overlearned that the correct answer there. So that would be the C part. Do is this idea that we need practice to get better. Obviously, we've talked about this before, but there's so many little conditions on what's the right way to do the practice. So in the first part, I talk about getting the difficulty right. I talk about the idea that you want to have variability in your practice. So if you don't want to just do things repetitively, you want to vary it, mix it up. That's much more important for building robust skills. I talk a little bit about transfer, which is this idea that like if you practice one thing, how much does it make you better at another thing? And there is I would say quite a disappointing strand of research that shows that doing a lot of practice at one thing actually transfers very narrowly to something else, which is something that, again, I think a lot of people have mistaken ideas about. So certainly if you think about people who are like learning chess and spending all their time practicing chess so they can be a great critical thinker in some other area of life, there's quite a bit of evidence against that. And then finally, we talk a little bit about the need to not only do things in in just sort of a school classroom laboratory, but doing things in real life, getting that sort of real world feedback. So the whole last section of the book is talking about feedback, about how it's very important to get information to calibrate your judgment. So I have a whole chapter where I talk about how if you kind of related to the point we were talking about earlier, that if you keep practicing a skill, you get more fluent, but you don't necessarily get more accurate. And that's particularly true in domains without feedback. So there's lots of examples of areas where professionals who have many, many years of experience do really poorly. Like they do much more poorly than like a simple spreadsheet with like a yes/no rule would do, simply because they don't have enough feedback. They're not able to calibrate these sort of complicated judgments. And then also even things like how our emotions are. So the sort of original examples were by a psychologist named Paul Meehl, and he looked at clinicians. So the examples were things like, for instance, parole decisions. So this is a situation where the parole board has to decide whether or not someone's going to reoffend based on, their psychological profile, how they were in prison, all this data. And then they have to make this decision. And in this particular study, there were 3 psychologists, and there was sort of like a whenever there was a consensus among the psychologists, then that went forward. And then they look at the actual success rate later. So this is a kind of prediction where you can actually check whether their judgment was accurate, because you can actually see whether they thought this person would reoffend and didn't. And they compared that with a statistical rule was just basically, I don't know how many factors they have, but they just sort of like came up with like, okay, you know, how violent was their crime? How old are they? Like, and then whether that was just a yes, no in their favor, like kind of like pros and cons, basically a list, right? And it turned out that the pros and cons list did better than the 3 psychologists who had like all this expertise. And that, you know, this is just one particular finding, but there's lots of findings from, you know, from psychology, from places where people make decisions, you know, and the idea here being that a lot of these types of experts just, they're not very good at kind of aggregating information in a way that this sort of simple rule apply. And a major reason for that is that they're not able to get the feedback that would be able to calibrate those decisions. So this is an area where I think it's certainly possible to be like an eminent expert and not actually be skilled at any, like, you know, thing that you would expect that person to be able to do with the knowledge, simply because they're not calibrated with the feedback for that particular environment. So again, these sort of see-do feedback are kind of essential elements. And in each chapter, I kind of go through some vignette from the research, from stories, and then kind of like the practical implications for what that means for mastery. And then, you know, that was my last book.
So as you mentioned that, the see-do feedback, for me, the immediate place my brain goes to is the value in a coach. And it seems like so much of those 3 domains, the process gets expedited when there's a coach or a mentor or somebody there to, one, that you can, you know, see and learn from, and then 2, you know, implement and do yourself, and then get that feedback from that coach. It seems like, you know, it really just reaffirms and reminds me of the value in coaches. And I'm curious if you think, based on what you said, you know, I feel like some of the best coaches are people who naturally weren't good at something, and then over time they figured out their way to get better and get good at that thing. And because they didn't have that natural inclination towards that thing, it makes them a good coach.
Yeah. No, I agree. I definitely agree with you that coaching is very important. I would put coaching in a similar vein as teaching, as mentorship, like this kind of, you know, even peer support too. I think that's another area which is very important. Like all the successful entrepreneurs I know tend to be fairly networked individuals. And some of that, you know, can be said, oh, well, if you have a big network, then you have all these people can help you out. But I think it's actually the knowledge transfer that, like, if you're in the hub of a big network of people, you know everything that everyone's doing. You know, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like, you could maybe not even be that smart, but just be able to, through this absorption process, have more knowledge than someone who is, you know, individually brilliant, but otherwise isolated. And so I think that's sort of an essential part. That was the whole C component of this process. And certainly, I think that when we're talking about how we improve, it's important to be a good mentee. It's important to be a good student. So there's that sort of converse of the equation. I think sometimes, you know, I don't know whether you have encountered this kind of tendency, but there's a lot of people who, like, I want to get a coach, I want to have a mentor, I want to have something like this, kind of so that I can offload the work from myself. So, like, I don't have to, like, do some effortful things or do things on my own or figure out things on my own. But in reality, being coached and figuring out things on your own are, like, really good complements. So they work really well together. So the person who, you know, gets a little bit of advice and then runs with it for a while and then they hit a wall and then they come back, they're going to go so much further than the person who's, like, they take one step cautiously and then they look back and be like, is that right? And then they take another step and they say, is that right? Like, I think those people are going to end up going ahead in the long run.
The word that comes to mind from that is just agency for me. How big of a role do you think agency plays in just that whole equation of learning? Just being an individual that can get stuff or can figure things out, in the sense of, you know, they have that street smarts essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so to go back to what we were talking about before, I feel like agency, I mean, you could take that word and take it in a few different directions, but what I hear when I hear that word is related to a very similar concept in psychology called self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is this idea that my motivation to do something is sort of a function of 2 different factors. So one would be like my outcome expectations. It's like, it would be great if kind of stuff. And then also my, like, sort of mastery expectations, or my ability to do the thing that would lead to the result. And so you can believe that, it would be really great if you got in shape or got good grades or started a business. Like, those would be good for your life. But if you believe that the linkage is like, I wouldn't be able to take the action successfully to reach that outcome, then the motivation is low, even if you have like high value for that particular outcome. And so I think this is related to this idea that a lot of what we think of as like people who are kind of gritty and they're hardworking and kind of hard scrabble and this kind of stuff, they have a lot of this background mastery experience. It's a little bit like a well that they're able to like draw from when they encounter difficulties. Whereas a lot of people who kind of, they're hesitant, they only take one step before looking back, they give up all the time. It's because they don't have that same confidence. They don't have that same sort of wellspring of like examples of like, oh yes, but I tried this on my own last time and it worked. And so the question is, how do you become a person that has greater self-efficacy? And I think it is this sort of bootstrapping process of taking on smaller projects, taking on smaller challenges, slowly building up your confidence. I think if you have like a phobia about heights, like jumping out of an airplane is not usually the first step to take, because you're not going to do it, right? But you can, start standing on slightly higher ledges and slightly higher ledges. And so I think this idea of an incremental process for building this agency, an incremental process for building this self-efficacy and confidence is so important when it comes to learning, so important when it comes to any domain. Like, I can even say from my own experience, learning languages, for instance, I mean, there was a lot of fear involved in doing the project to begin with, because we didn't know whether it was going to work. We didn't know whether we were going to do it. By the time we got to the fourth country, it was like a routine. Like, there was just sort of like, oh yeah, this is what you're doing. You got to do this. And then it just felt very mundane. And so I think that's sort of how we approach everything in life. And so if you can kind of take on those small projects and build up that self-efficacy, yeah, at some point you're just doing things that you didn't think you could do a long time ago.
You mentioned the word confidence, and I'm curious about like your thoughts on learning confidence, or learning some of these things that might be a little bit hard to quantify. And I know, there's the whole school of thought that you develop confidence through undeniable proof. And then there's the other subset of individuals that are like, you have to scream affirmations in the mirror, and that's going to make you confident.
Yeah.
But from just a perspective of such a knowledge base on how to learn, like, do you feel like some of these things, whether it's confidence or charisma, like, can you learn them the same way that you would learn Spanish?
Well, I think they're different in some ways. So, like, I think this idea of self-efficacy very much lines up with the sense of confidence in, like, am I confident about a math exam kind of confidence, right? And the sort of original researcher coined this idea, Albert Bandura. He had 4 different sources that led to confidence. So he had 2 strong sources and 2 weak ones. So the strong sources were personal mastery, meaning that if you succeed at the math test, that gives this like really good example of like, I can do similar math tests, right? The second one was vicarious experience. So if you see someone that you think is like you succeed at something, then you can also, through analogy, draw that experience to yourself. Your friend who you think is about as smart as you comes out of that math exam and it's like, oh yeah, you've got it, it's no problem. That would make you feel confident, right? Maybe not if, like Stephen Hawking wheeled out of there, you'd be kind of like, maybe not. But as long as you can identify with the person that you have, so vicarious experience, this is again, the role of seeing other people is very important, because if you have a personal friend, for instance, that's like an entrepreneur, you're much more likely to become an entrepreneur and inventor yourself. That's an interesting kind of statistical finding. And I think a lot of that is, not just the networks and this kind of thing, but the idea that like, oh, someone could be an inventor as a career choice. If you don't have that example, it's hard to follow. The 2 weaker ones were bodily state. This tends to be more of a negative factor on confidence, but you can imagine if you're like, jittering, that sense of arousal could undermine your own confidence, because you interpret these bodily signals of like, oh, I'm terrified, I'm shaking, my palms are sweating, like I can't stand on stage. And then the other one was exhortation, or like this kind of, you can do it, and cheerleading and this kind of stuff. So to answer your question, I think like, assuming you believe Bandura and his research and this kind of thing, the confidence comes from competence is probably the most correct view, although the right way of thinking about it is that it is this bootstrapping process. So, if you don't have it, you can't have it, but you start small and you build up. So that would be, I would think, the more correct approach. And exhortation, affirmation, this kind of state stuff is momentary, and you can probably get some sort of small effect in the moment by changing your state. Certainly by controlling your attention, athletes like visualize and do stuff like this as a way of like shaping what they're attending to. That can also, change your self-efficacy or confidence in the moment. But it's probably not going to be as important or durable as effect as sort of like having the confidence. So I would say, like, long term, if you want to be confident at things, you need to bootstrap successes up in that space. And also watch people who are successful, very important part, because if you're not successful yourself, it can be harder to bootstrap it. And then your second point about charisma, which I think deals with confidence more in the like social domain, like sort of like what makes you confident, if you're, a single man talking to women, or what makes you confident on stage, or what gives you sort of presence. And I do think that that's probably similar to what we were talking about before about self-efficacy, but in the social domain. So self-efficacy is quite domain specific. Like, I could be really confident about math and then feel like I'm going to go up to this hot girl and ask her on a date and fail utterly. Like, we know stereotypes of people that have those divergent senses of confidence. So that's totally a plausible thing. And I think a lot of what the same kind of idea about like charisma, probably there's some social skills there too. So like, learning to listen, learning to make eye contact, how to tell good stories. But a lot of it, again, is this sort of comfort level, like of not being anxious, not being nervous. And I think, again, that is one of these self-efficacy things. So, if you want to build up that feeling in some domain, then you got to do it. So if you want to be more comfortable as a salesperson, you got to make more sales calls. If you want to be more comfortable on stage, you got to give more speeches. And this is this sort of reinforcing thing that changes the emotional state. So, I have a whole chapter in the book where we talk about fear, and how that, like, there's all this research that shows that this sort of sense of our own emotions are linked in that way.
I'm glad you brought up fear, because it's such a big part of, you don't think about fear in the sense of learning. Like, you don't see those two things as connected, but like when you hear about some of the stuff that you've done, and there's a lot of fear that you got to get over in those domains, and then you think about just like looking like a fool. And we're so scared to look like a fool or to embarrass ourselves in many ways. But like, that's how you learn, and I'm very curious about what you've learned about when it comes to the domain of fear.
Yeah, I mean, I do think what you're saying is correct, that there is an element of fear in many aspects of learning, and that you need to, again, kind of going to this sort of like starting small and building up, that you need to build this self-efficacy. You need to like clamp down on some of those fear responses. And I think that that's more relevant in areas where like the fear is kind of more primal, I guess you could say. Like, I think a lot of people naturally have fear speaking another language. And so you can see this, and this is related to, like, I often will interact with people, and they'll ask me for advice and things like that in language learning. And one of the things that I notice is that, like, people hate the suggestion, like, oh, well, you should just set up a time and just speak in that language. People hate that advice. Like, I gave a TEDx talk with Vat, who I went on the trip with, and it was just sort of like, that was the advice. It was like, okay, well, try doing this. And I can't tell you, like, there's like only a handful of people that I've like told this story to where they're like, yeah, I'm going to do that. But if you tell people like, oh, maybe you can get this app on your phone so you don't actually have to talk to people, people are like, oh yeah, no, I'm going to do that one instead. I'm going to do that one. So I think this idea of like fear shaping how we approach things is very important. But the thing that I like to try to put forth to people, and I think it's an important idea as well, is that the fear itself is a little bit irrational. So we have this kind of idea like, oh, well, I'm going to be speaking only in Spanish, and it's going to be so embarrassing. I'm going to make so many mistakes. People are going to think less of me. And the main sort of finding I had from that trip is that actually almost never happened. So it's one of those things where, like, the fear goes away in part because it's actually absurd. It's not actually, you're fearing something that's ridiculous.
Such a great point.
Yes, sometimes it's tiring. I would agree with that. Sometimes you struggle to communicate, but like the amount of times where like we were in like Spain or China where like someone was like, like it was embarrassing for us because of our like Spanish or Chinese, like vanishingly few. There was like almost no circumstances where that happened. And I don't want to say that your experience will be 100% the same. I definitely, people will be like, well, there was that one time I went on, to France and people didn't like that I was speaking in French. I don't want to say it's
French,
impossible,
though.
but
It's always the French.
well, I love the French. I love France. I love the French, but they are particular about the language. So, but I mean, I just mean to say that, part of this fear thing is that I think in some cases the antidote to fear is curiosity. That it's not so much an issue of like, okay, you need to do this thing that is going to be super unpleasant, but that you don't even know what it's going to be like when you try it, right? And because you're afraid to try it, you're afraid to go through it. So the language learning example, I think, is a perfect case in that, because I've now done this method of like immersion, semi-immersion in various contexts with like 6 different languages now. And so I have a fairly good sampling of how it goes across different scenarios. And I don't want to say it's always easy, but like the most negative experience that I typically have with it is just you're having a conversation with someone and you cannot figure out what they're saying and they've had to repeat themselves 3 times and you're like, oh, should I just smile or should I, so that's about the worst experience that you get to, it's never like they're making you feel bad for it. And usually it's the opposite, when we were traveling, the amount of times you get like, oh, more foreigners should be like you get like these props for like putting in the barest minimum of effort.
So true. I mean, I even think about like, it's helpful when you see things in like the reverse. Like I remember being in, I think it was like Italy, and the waiter was trying to speak to us in English, and he wasn't obviously a native English speaker. He struggled a little bit, and he was so embarrassed. Like you could see it on his face. But yet for us, it was like, I mean, we were just so grateful that he was trying, and there was like no judgment on our end, like by any stretch of the imagination. And when you like flip the script, you could kind of see how imaginary a lot of that fear could be. But I mean, I just love what you said about the antidote of fear is curiosity. And I mean, because I think on one side, it's like the only way to get over your fear is the curiosity being stronger than that fear. And you don't know. Like you don't know, and you have these preconceived notions on what you believe to be true. The people judging you for speaking English or speaking French or Italian, and they they're judging you for how bad you are at it. But so often it's like these preconceived notions we had they're just delusional.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's certainly the case that not all of learning is about fear and about doing this kind of thing. But I do think that very often when you see people doing something that's like really counterproductive or like kind of like obviously the wrong way to do it, there's some kind of emotional block that I would relate to that. So, as I said, I feel like, certainly there's people who they have only very minimal motivation to learn another language. And so, playing Duolingo on their phone is like, that's good for them. That's about as all that they're willing to do. I'm willing to devote 5 minutes of my bathroom time for like, for this activity. But I do know other people that I feel like gets, like they get really worked up about the idea of like speaking another language to someone. And it's clear that the block is more, it's more psychological than about competence, right? It's more about, what happens if I say something and they don't understand? And then they'll be like, huh? Or what? What happens if they say something that I don't understand? You can say, I don't understand. Or if you don't know how to say that, you can like type it into your phone and be like, I don't understand. Like you can do all those things. So I think this is one of those examples where, the curiosity is not, because I think if I tell people, okay, go do something that's going to be like awful for you, like there's going to be no takers on that. But if you reframe what you're doing as, I'm going to do this and I don't know how it's going to turn out, and this is going to be a bit of an experiment, I think that's the right way to challenge a lot of your fears, rather than like, okay, I'm going to do it and it's going to be terrible. Maybe it will be, maybe it'll be scary, but maybe it won't be. Maybe it'll be actually surprisingly fine, and you'll be like, wow, why wasn't I doing this a long time ago?
I think it's a great perspective on things. So we've mentioned immersion, deliberate practice. We talked about, some of the elements of mastery and fear and agency. But when it comes to some of the other things that we haven't mentioned, I know we're leaving a lot on the table when it comes to learning and the key elements there. What are some things that we've yet to talk about that you feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big topic. Like I've written thousands of articles on my website, so if anyone wants to
No
see
doubt.
free articles
Thousands
on
and
my website
thousands,
about
right?
it,
It's very
there's a
impressive.
lot.
I
There's a
recommend
lot.
everybody
So
go check out your blog because it's impressive.
So there's always so many more things to discuss and talk about. I think one thing that we haven't talked about, which I often talk about in this context, is the idea of meta learning, or learning how to learn something before you go into it. And it goes back to what we were talking about in the start of the conversation, where there's no magic to learning. There's just like little bits and pieces that you have to acquire. But I think what is often the block for going forward is that we take it as this big monolithic thing. We take it as this kind of, okay, like either you get it or you don't, you have the talent or you don't, rather than, okay, there's like this big list of skills and knowledge that I need to acquire. And each individual thing is not too hard. Like you can definitely do it. But when you add it all together, it becomes this sort of whole that results in an ability that's, special, or it stands out. And so my advice to people is whatever thing that you're struggling with, the thing that you're trying to have a skill, as a competence, try to figure out how does it break down. And so in the book, Ultralearning, I talk about breaking it down into procedures, or things that you do, facts, things that you know or remember, concepts, things that you understand. And if you can just sort of break it down, even into like a very rough list, it gives you this sort of tractable set of to do things for accomplishing that skill. So if you're trying to learn chess or play the piano, or you want to be a good dancer, or you want to be better at designing web pages, or whatever it is, you can kind of come up with like what would be the skills, what would be the things that you'd have to acquire, and that's usually the starting point. And so I think creating that roadmap, figuring out what you need to do next. And then after that, all you have to do is the work. You just have to do it.
Yeah, I'm sure that's another one that people don't like. Another piece of advice people don't enjoy hearing, when you just say, it's a matter of just doing it. We tend to mystify, a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I think all I can do is try to explain to my best understanding how learning works and what they would need to do to acquire a skill or subject. And I think, it's like you can get the trainer, but they can't make you exercise. Like you still have to do it yourself. And I think there's a similar idea with learning. Like you can have the best teacher, the best coaches, but if you're still under the delusion that like you can become really good at something without acquiring the little bits and pieces, then, all right, you find someone else maybe who's going to give you that sales pitch. But I think once you know what you need to do and you know what the work's involved, then yeah, it's actually not so bad doing it. Like I feel like you can, if I just told you, okay, well, to be proficient in a language, you need to be pretty fluent in about at least a couple thousand words. Maybe even you can get by with 1,000 and you could probably do pretty good. All right, let's get 1,000 on your flashcards of your phone. That's not the only thing you need to do, but it's a good start, right?
Oh, yeah.
If it's just like, okay, I'm going to do, I'm going to do 10 words a day, right? All right. See you in 100 days, and then you've got those words. So this is not magic, but it is something that you could do. In 100 days, you could learn 1,000 words in a language, which is quite a bit. It's quite enough that you could go travel there and communicate with people, provided you have like a few sentences to glue them into, and you can actually say them and pronounce them out loud. Like that's about it. I'm oversimplifying things a little bit, but not too much. That's my point.
No, totally. Totally. And even just like, I love what you said, when you have that roadmap and you could break things down in that way, like that's not how people think about learning a language. But when you really break it down, right, it's like, is it 1,200 words they say that the average human has in their active vocabulary? Something around that, right?
Oh, I don't know. Well, I know that the amount of words that like a college educated speaker would know by reading would be considerably higher than that. Like probably I would say I think the estimates of like word families, so that like says all the like, words that are kind of modifications of the same word. I want to say that it's in the tens of thousands, but I think it depends on the way you define it. It could be between like 20,000 to 100,000, but you definitely need way less than that to have everyday conversations, and that's because words follow something called Zipf's law, which it goes down sort of basically the frequency of encountering a word is 1 over its like rank in the distribution, and so like the word the is like some enormous percentage of all English words in any given text, and like some extremely far down the list word happens almost never. So if you don't know that whole last tail, you actually still understand 99% of the time. So I feel
Totally.
like that's even more true in conversations where not only do people use simplified vocabularies in conversation typically compared to long form text, but they also tend to, have there's more room for error, because if you don't understand something, people can adjust to your level and this kind of thing.
Hmm.
So my advice to people is, and again, maybe 1,000 is not the right word, but I'm just breaking this down into a task that I think would be eminently achievable for most people. And throw in that a little bit of practice, so you can actually get used to saying them, and you could probably do it too. So the learning a language to like a modest level in 3 months is not an insane goal. This is not something that you need to be some kind of freak to do. You just have to be diligent about it.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting though when you think about it that way, and then think about how you learned Spanish when you were in, school growing up. They're two very different things, to say the least. But
Yeah.
that's a conversation for a whole other day. I'm very curious. I mean, having written as many essays as you have, is there any that stick out to you, or any that you feel like are particularly of interest? Because you don't just talk. I mean, we've talked a lot today about learning and getting better at things. That's not all the tools in the toolkit, if you will, or things that you talk
Yeah.
about. Is there any of the essays that stick out to you? Or
I don't know. I mean, there's just been so many I've written on so many different topics. So my advice usually to people, if they're interested, is they go to scotthyyoung.com/blog/articles. And I have not only like, out like by chronology, like 20 years of writing there, but I also have sections where I have like the best of certain categories or certain topics, including some like nearly book length things. So if someone was like, okay, I want to go deep in this topic, that would be where I'd send them.
awesome. Well, Scott, dude, I appreciate you so much for taking time today. Very fun conversation for me. I think the takeaway for the audience is like, go chase some of that fear. Be willing to break things down and just, approach it step by step basis, and understand that path through mastery is see do feedback. I think that's a great way to break things down.
Perfect. Yeah. Couldn't have said it better myself.